Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. On behalf of myself, thank you. I appreciate you coming out, and I'd like to make a couple notes on drawing. If you're going to endeavor painting light as realistically as you see in the photo or as realistically as you envision it, all of that effort will be undercut immediately if you have errant perspective lines and all of this stuff. It just kind of detracts from that endeavor. So I put in the grueling effort of drawing multiple versions of the same one in advance so that you didn't have to sit here and watch me do that. When it comes to hot press paper, which is the paper that I use, it is so important to not mar the surface of the paper that errant drawing lines and even one or two wrong guesses and the amount of erasure that it requires, they render it almost impossible to paint the way you might want to. So that's why I am meticulous about measuring things out and using a ruler for everything. People ask me, how do you get your lines so straight? I say, a ruler. It's not a secret. So you can see that I've very faintly painted in the light temperatures that I see in my reference. We're taught often in sort of an academic setting that the approach to light is fairly simple, that your warm light is your yellows, your oranges, your reds. That's what you want to use for sunlight or things that sunlight is hitting. And then your blues, well, that's what you reserve for your shadows. And often, most of the time, that's accurate, but not all the time. Sometimes you'll have a situation in a painting where something is in shadow, but there is a flat surface immediately beneath it. That flat surface reflects light back up onto the object that's casting the shadow. And so you get something of a gradation, and that gradation might look something along these lines. And so you'll get this really simple sort of gradation that goes from the cool blue light to the warmth of reflected light immediately below it. So what I've done is I've started to paint with two pigments that I've found to be especially useful in depicting light, a warm yellow and a cool blue. These were pigments that I arrived at after trying for a long time to produce the same gradation that I just did on the back there. For like the first 5 or 6 times that I tried all the different blues and yellows that came in my starter pack here, they all resulted in green. And well, that's especially not appropriate for what I was trying to convey in terms of light and shadow until I arrived at yellow ochre and French ultramarine, both granular pigments. And later I made a switch to golden ochre instead of yellow ochre because it's a little bit higher key, it's got a warmth to it. Yellow ochre is a little bit more muted, a little bit more neutral in comparison. I should note that the golden ochre is a little bit more light fast, so when you're dealing with it, I definitely recommend using like a UV plex instead. And what I noticed, being that they are both granular pigments, is that I was able to create a mixture of those two that once it dried, didn't turn green. Instead, it read as both yellow and blue combined. And part of that has a lot to do with the fact that I paint on 300-pound hot press. It does this cool granulating thing really, really well. You can lift very, very easily. You can even lift inadvertently, and that happens as well if you're not being careful. But one thing that happens with cold press or rough press or anything with more tooth than this paper is that when your pigment falls out and when it dries, it settles into the tooth of the paper. Whereas on anything that's smooth, like hot press, or in a really exaggerated way, UPO, things tend to fall out the way water and pigment want to. So as you can see, I'm starting this wash back here. I've got everything that I want covered on the paper covered, for now at least. You know, most academics would never advise just slathering a big streak of black through the whole thing so early in the painting. But I have noted that if you wait to put any dark values, or even values in like the 3/4 of dark and darker side of things, you're going to run into an issue with simultaneous contrast, which is, your eye sees that dark and suddenly everything else is much lighter than you intended it to be, and you have to paint it all over again. And that's a whole lot of wasted time. So what I like to do is fairly early on in the painting, I like to get punchy quickly. And I like to do so in places that aren't going to put me in a bad way when I try to lay a wash down. So I'm still just using primarily our golden ochre and our French ultramarine on this particular wash over in this corner. I'm going to use a little bit of sepia. It's a little bit of cheating, but I'm just trying to push that dark value so that I'm making the best decisions with all the information that I possibly can throughout the duration of our time painting here. Now, one thing that I'm doing here, I am starting to introduce a little bit of yellow, that warm value towards the bottom here, and keeping the top darker. In the space, we've got some light that's falling out on the floor here, and that light, and any light that's coming through this window, whether reflected or not, is bouncing up and falling out in this direction. So you'll have darker values up top. You can even see it in this panel here, where it's a little bit bluer and a little bit warmer as you get towards the bottom. The same could be said for this door here, as it's cooler up top and gets progressively warmer towards the bottom. That's just that light reflecting and doing precisely what I was referring to. So that first wash that I had put down before I even started painting, as far as you knew, was just flat values, with the exception of this one graded value here on the floor. What I'm going to start doing now is combinations of the yellow and the blue, the French ultramarine and the golden ochre, and starting to do some of the gradations as well to capture that sense of reflected light. It's always an adventure to pick what wash you're going to do next if you're working in from the perimeter, because you've run out of places to put your hand most of the time. I'm going to shoot for this big middle portion here, just so you can see in the reference. There's a bit of a reflected light that comes up directly from the top of the radiator here. As this light comes in through the window and bounces up, it bounces right onto this surface here. There also is sort of a warm passage here that I think is reflected from the floor. And then all of that falls off as it gets closer to the edge of this door here, as it works itself into the corner. To do that, I am going to mix up larger quantities of what I normally use. I have 4 different sort of sets of values, and what it looks like is exclusively the golden ochre, then an ochre-heavy sort of 3/4-ish position between that and the French ultramarine, and then a French ultramarine sort of 3/4 or maybe even thirdsy way between the two, and then one that is more just straight French ultramarine. First thing I'm going to do is kind of justify to this edge over here. I'm painting straight down, despite, I don't know if you can see, there are little notches for where the bricks are. I'm going to ignore those and come back for them later. I'm going to take the next value, the next closest to blue, and just run that down this side here. An important thing to remember with this technique, with anything when you're dealing with trying to get solid granulation, is that keeping a lot of water on the paper is a huge deal. Because there's nothing worse, as I'm sure a handful of you can attest, than trying to put down this super stressful wash, and then you get so far and you realize, I don't have enough paint to do this, and I need to mix up more of the exact same dilutions and solutions that I had, except by the time it takes me to finish that, now my paint has dried and I've got the choppiest wash you ever did see, and who wants to look at that? So you have to figure out something to hide it with later. Fortunately, in my painting, I've got water stains and bricks and all sorts of extra things to get me out of that trouble, but I try not to rely on that stuff. I try to paint well the first time, because there's just nothing like a crisp, clean wash as far as I'm concerned. All right, so we got that in there. I'm going to work on this wash right here. It's just a shadow. It connects with all the other shadows, as they do. But I'd like to get that gradation in there. It's definitely on the warmer side up top as well, and it gets even warmer as we get towards the bottom. Let's see, I'd like to give a note on brushes while I'm talking about materials. I've been using the same crappy brushes since college. They are whatever the brush equivalent of threadbare is. They're not in good shape. And so, I don't know. It's one of those, like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. I do treat myself to a new number 6 every time I finish a full sheet because I just absolutely abuse my number 6 brushes. They're my workhorse. I paint these little tiny lines with them, and I paint giant washes that no one has any business painting with a number 6 brush. But it's all about cohesion. I mean, that's the real reason that I paint with this technique and this way in general, is because having a cohesive sense of light is just so important to creating a believable space. I'm building up layers to achieve that sort of depth. As you layer these granular pigments, it does tend to have a bit of a sort of cumulative effect. You will note that the granulation sort of is enhanced. The scale is usually not made much larger, like the scale of the granulation, but sometimes it is. So that is something to sort of keep in mind, that you don't want to go too nuts with it if you don't want that hefty of a granulation. Because scale is important. I mean, sometimes you want a bigger scale of mark making, even if it's granulation in foreground objects as opposed to objects that are further in the background. I wouldn't want them to share the same texture at the same scale. I think it would be inappropriate. But I have a whole bunch of other transparent pigments that I use in addition to kind of my big 6 granular pigments. I would say the big 6 include the French ultramarine, the golden ochre, the burnt sienna, sepia, cad red. Yeah, I think that was it. 5, the big 5. Now that's mostly for, that's for the underpainting. But then I take local colors and apply that over top of it. And that's how I get, whatever the local color of the thing is. It might be bricks, it might be, wood paneling, it might be the floor of this particular painting. Having a cohesive palette is also not a bad thing. If your work is recognizable because of your palette, that's, again, part of finding your voice and finding what distinguishes you from your contemporaries. I'll continue working on this for a little bit before I bring out the thing that I've developed a little bit more. Initially, when I started painting interiors, it was because I wanted to photograph them. And I saw that I had this giant body of photographs full of really compelling material that was also formally interesting. And under the advisement of some close friends and a professional sort of existential crisis, when I found myself painting things that people painted 30 years ago, the 70s, Photorealism was like, they were really committed to diners and stuff like that. And while I shared an affinity for those things and my interest in it was honest, I don't think that what I was saying was actually that important for where we were, historically. But it caused me to think about what I should be painting and what my voice is. And like I said, it threw me into a tiny bit of a tailspin, and I really racked my brain for a while about what that meant professionally, and was I a sham? And these are the things you think about in undergrad and realize that undergraduates have no business thinking about, thinking of themselves that way, but it is what it is. And a close friend said, why don't you just paint something that makes you happy? So I started painting the abandoned interiors. They were interesting, they intrigued me, they were compelling. I think the next thing is the floor, and then we'll almost be caught up with my other painting. So one more wash down here at the bottom. I am going to introduce a different pigment just to speed things up a little bit. And after this one, we'll jump into the next one and we'll start layering local color in as well. You can kind of see there are little dots throughout some of the perspective lines and through some of the bricks and things like that. That's because I like to plot everything out in this really kind of maniacally precise way where I take my image in Photoshop and I crop it to the exact dimensions of my support, the piece of paper that I'm working on. And then I bring the rulers up in Photoshop. I slide the sliders to whatever point I'm trying to get to, and then I measure, plot that point, and then I do the corresponding other end of that perspective line, and then I draw the line. And then I do the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 times 2, that's 40 points just to get those floorboards. And it's maddening, but it's right. And sometimes being right is more important than your sanity. Just working through those gradations there. I'm going to bring just a tiny little bit of that shadow up on here because we want to be consistent. And with the exception of the radiator and all of the blood, sweat, and tears that would take, that puts us at a pretty cohesive and well laid out place. I do have some images here that sort of give you an idea of the step-by-step involved in that process, building up those values, building up those layers to the point where we arrive not just at this, but at this. And so that's where I'm going to pick up. So I want to build up just a tiny bit of value with some gradations in these corners here. And then I'd like to set in on some local value. Now, you can see in my original image, all of the walls are white, which is great for my purposes as a person who's trying to observe light. But what I'm going to do is, instead of leaving that brick wall white, I'm going to go ahead and layer in some bricks as well so that you can see how we can go very quickly from something that could be closer to a final product to something that looks a little bit more intentional. To do that, I need to very quickly line in the verticals on some bricks. And I'm going to use this amazing ruler. It's a quilting ruler. At every 1/8 of an inch, there's another line. They're great for perspective. You can see exactly where the last perspective line is if you overlap and move forward, and you can see whether or not your lines are in fact converging rather than diverging when they're supposed to be or not supposed to be. It's just a good way to sort of like check yourself. So with those bricks mapped in, I would like to get just a little bit more local value, some what I would call, I don't know if you'd call this scumbling. It's kind of scumbly. A little bit of precision mixed with a little bit of not precision back here. Right now, in addition to the texture provided by the granulation, I'm just sort of fooling around, adding a little bit more, just something a little bit more gestural, something a little bit more painterly, which, could feel contrived if you're feeling critical, but I just like, being a little bit more gestural. I like something that has a little bit of energy to it, in addition to all the precision. Once you get all that precision laid down, there's opportunity to play fast and loose. I don't think that the time to do that is when you're dealing with perspective lines. Some people may do that really well. I am not one of them. I don't trust my gesture muscles to do that well. Taking the brush on its side, and I'm just sort of filling in, but I'm leaving some tall, skinny, foreshortened shapes on the side of the wall. There's a panel of bricks right here that is painted white. I haven't decided if I'm going to leave it white, but I want to deal with something important first while it's white because I think it'll be easier for everybody to see if I do. Bricks are a pain. There are rarely any way to deal with them that isn't just painting every one of them. One thing that I think is important about bricks in a way that will help you do them quickly is by thinking about depth. You have your initial value, which is just your light temperature as I did it. You have any shadows with any variations in light temperature as I did it here with getting cooler down to getting lighter with the reflected light. That's, step one. But there are also smaller shadows on the surface of the bricks. And what you need to do when you're painting those shadows is consult your reference, A, and B, be consistent with what you've established in the gradations already. So if I'm going to make a shadow that's cast by the overhang of the bricks, if the mortar kind of dips in a little bit, we want that to be reflected in the same color that it's immediately next to. So towards the top, I'm going to want that to be bluer, and as I get closer to the bottom, we're going to get progressively more yellow. So one thing that's super difficult to see, in my reference here, I can see that those shadows cast by those bricks in the shadowed area on the left here, rather than the really sun-bleached area, the shadows themselves are actually warm. And that's in consistency with this spot on the floor that's reflecting back up at them. So I'm going to run those in real quick, just like I did the last ones. So I would like to take a little bit of time and go over, some local color. I leave my palette a mess, especially with bricks. You need a whole bunch of different colors, and some of them are bluish, and I've got that, and some of them are purplish, and I've got that. Just sort of float that in to those spaces. I'm not being super precise with it. It's not worth it. And it tends to be less realistic. If you paint bricks really precisely, they look like they look fake. Start to vary the colors that you're using. Normally, I'll take a couple passes with bricks. I'm not satisfied after just one. That texture really does need to be built up a little bit. Eventually, I'm going to have to go in and we'll need a little bit of, black or as close to black as that part of the painting has to remain consistent with the value scale that we establish. And sometimes that can be like a little hole in the brick, sometimes it can be a hole in the mortar. The danger with CAD red when you're dealing with bricks is it is very opaque. So that would be one thing to be careful with, is if you've put the effort into laying all of this down, building up all of this texture, and then you start to throw opaque pigments over top of it and just obliterate it. That's not the good kind of settling things in that I was referring to earlier. It's something that I feel like is probably a little bit of a missed opportunity, you could say. And because I haven't yet put any kind of shadows on the mortar in this, I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And you'll see how much, you don't know, again, how easy it is to see here. You've got the local color, you've got your value, you've got your light temperature established there, but that little bit of extra dark value for the ledges in the mortar is what we're shooting for next. So generally, with bricks, this is our mortar, these are our bricks. So if the light is coming down from the top, then the shadow on the edge of the brick, provided that the mortar is like recessed and not just flat, it's going to cast a shadow on the top half of the mortar. However, if the light is actually reflected light and is bouncing off the floor and back up, it's going to be there instead. So I think that I'm going to do that down here at the bottom and then sort of fade that off as I get towards the top. And we'll just see how that goes, and hopefully it works well. Sounds right in theory, right? As I'm, adding these shadows, these lines, these little recesses here and there, I'm not doing a solid line. I'm varying it. I think that that's important. Yeah, so the bricks, that's the whole, the layering, the use of this as an underpainting. Now, for our purposes, because, again, because of the reference and because this wall happened to be white and these bricks happened to be painted, it could have just been the underpainting, and it would have been true to what was in the photo because it was just white. The local color of this was white, despite the light temperature. But I think that A, for the sake of the demonstration, and B, for the sake of just making the whole composition more interesting, adding those bricks was definitely a good option. I'm going to do, I think, one more quick thing here on the sides. And those shapes that I had made earlier, those sort of plaster scrapes or wallpaper glue or, what have you, all I'm doing is on the edge of any light shapes, the edge that is on not the light source side, but on the back side, I'm just going to add a little tiny line of shadow that gives you the sense that it's got a little bit of depth to it, so that we're creating some additional texture on that wall there. I'm in the same mode and have the same really delicate little brush. I'd like to add some detail to this door. That looks like it's definitely seen better days. And those little details definitely help to bring things forward. If you really wanted to get meticulous, you could add a little bit of that same shadow that I just did over on this other side to those areas where the paint has chipped. A little bit more intentionality, a little bit more attention to detail, kind of thing that people generally appreciate. Whether it's really needed or not, for your eye to get the gist of it is another question, but it's nice to have. I'm going to mix a pigment that is not any of those ones, and I think that I'm going to use a little bit of Winsor Blue, and a little tiny bit of cerulean. The windows here are tremendously dusty and dirty, and there's light coming through them, so anywhere where there's dust or dirt on the window is very light, and it kind of falls off before it gets to either of those spots, so we're just going to work with what's there. The lifting ability that you have with hot press might be well applied, because you can see through the clearer portions of the windows, not through the white areas. You can see buildings, and so normally if I was painting those, even sort of lightly to combat the tendency that all of those edges had to be really sharp, sharp focus, I would probably go in with the scrubber. I think I may have been a hair aggressive with that blue, but I'm thinking that I'll probably put some black detailing in the windowsill, like the window panes, that are gonna push that, because again, that simultaneous contrast, it's gonna push it back in the other direction, so I'm not super stressed about it. And I don't think that there's a whole lot of precision. Thank you, everybody.